So today's Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't exactly complete Jonouchi's arc, but it brings us pretty close. After what happened between him and Kaiba in his last duel, with Kaiba telling him off at the end, saying that he's worthless, he'll be too afraid after this, he's a loser, Jonouchi's having a rough time. He has a nightmare about it, which seems kind of goofy because this is a card game, but remember the situation these kids are in. This is a life or death situation. For Yugi's grandfather, for Kaiba's little brother, and for Jonouchi's sister a little less literally. But still, it's a pretty grave situation for her too. So knowing the stakes, knowing how serious this tournament is, even though it is a card game tournament, it makes sense that Jonouchi would be affected as heavily as he is here. The thought of him not being able to continue and keep trying to help his sister and keep trying to help his friends, like, he's the kind of guy that would really weigh at him, right? But he's also not the kind of person who likes to have to rely on people, and he's the kind of person who doesn't like to show weakness. So he tries to psych himself up, and yet when he goes off to take a leak, as he and the others are waking up and getting ready to set out for the second day of the contest, and some guys come up and drag him off, he's pretty freaked out by it. These are guys whose names I do not remember, save for one of them who, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't even there when Jonouchi got dragged off, are a trio working with that Keith character that we were introduced to because of that Pegasus flashback in the last review. This is the guy that Pegasus humiliated, ruining his career. And here he is now on the island, and we find out that he's helping these other three guys because he wants the four of them to be the four who make it into the castle for the finals. Something that even Kaiba has to try to do. Even Kaiba has to play by Pegasus' rules, because knowing that Kaiba was coming, and we see this at the beginning of the first of these chapters, knowing that Kaiba was coming, Pegasus locked himself in the part of the castle that is blocked off by a lock that can only be opened with 10 star chips, ensuring that even Kaiba has to play by Pegasus' own rules. Keith wants another swing at Pegasus, so he's teamed up with these guys to ensure that they get inside along with him. Even though we find out that Keith wasn't invited to the tournament, he's a stowaway, kind of like Jonouchi, which makes for an interesting parallel between their characters. In fact, whereas Jonouchi is very much a brawler and he carries himself like a brawler and he's kind of gruff and rough around the edges, Keith is that even more so. You could imagine Jonouchi's pride being wounded to the same degree that Keith's pride was, and Jonouchi kind of going down a similar spiral. You kind of get the sense that that might be a thing that could happen to him, except that he has his friends to be his support network, preventing that. His friends and his sister, the thought of his sister, and not letting her down. But at the same time, Keith is despicable in ways that Jonouchi never could be, because Jonouchi, at heart, is a good person. Like, it's a little unobvious, and it might just be the translation I was reading too, but it seems like Keith is just an asshole. Like, he says derogatory stuff. Like, at one point he says something about Pegasus that sounds like he was being, like, real homophobic about the fact that Pegasus is kind of fruity. Like, he's just a gross person. And it's interesting. I think it says something pretty cool about Kazuki Takahashi, that he wrote this very obvious despicable villain character to have these thoughts, showing that he's probably a pretty decent guy about that stuff, right? And we find out from some of his internal dialogue that he doesn't even intend to help these other three guys get into the castle with him. He's going to let them win enough star chips that he can then take their star chips. Like, he doesn't say it outright here, or I guess think it outright here, but that's the implication, and we see that he does that later. Not in these chapters that I'm reviewing today, but, you know, it does happen. And you kind of get the sense from the chapters that I am going to be reviewing today that he might still just try to take Jonouchi's star chips anyway. Because they drag Jonouchi off to an underground cave that I assume Keith knows about them because he was in the U.S. Army at one point. Because apparently these caves were used by U.S. Army soldiers at some point in the past, and they buried some of their dead here. And so Pegasus, being the upstart, sensitive guy that he is, decided to put a card table down there with a field power bonus for zombies. Like, on top of the literal skeletal corpses of American soldiers, which I'm not a big fan of the U.S. military, but, like, you should respect people, especially dead people, up until the point that you know that there's literally no reason to respect them, right? This just seems super gross, even for Pegasus. But the card table that they dragged Jonouchi to so they could try to beat him and take his 4 star chips is literally sitting on top of the skeletons of these soldiers. And obviously this whole thing freaks Jonouchi out. He passes out first because of course he would. But he gets a little fired up when he realizes that these guys are a threat, and when again he psychs himself up to fight them because his pride was wounded and he's trying to recover from that. And so he duels not Keith, not either the 2 nameless minions, but specifically Ghost Kozuka, who I think has a different name in the Japanese version of the manga. I think he's one of the characters who they got a second non-Japanese name. Like, kind of like Ghost Kozuka obviously sounds like a Japanese name, but then they're called Bones. He's called Bones in the dub for some reason. I don't understand how they pick names for 4Kids anime. But anyway, Kozuka has had his deck souped up by Keith, who brought way more than the 40 cards that he was allowed to bring to the tournament, because again, he wasn't actually invited to the tournament. He doesn't feel like he has to follow the rules because he's already breaking the rules and getting away with it. And this is bad because not only is Kozuka a more experienced player than Jonouchi, but Keith is an even more experienced player than that, and he's helping Kozuka the same way that Yugi would often help Jonouchi. And so Jonouchi is here on his own, surrounded by enemies, in an environment that genuinely freaks him out of his depths in terms of experience. And he has no idea what his opponent's cards even do until he sees them take effect. The disadvantage that he's at here is staggering, and yet he fights on. And just the fact that he fights on instead of trying to run away, trying to fight his way out and run away, proves that Kaiba's wrong. Kaiba is just wrong about him. And then as the duel goes on and Keith keeps instructing Kozuka to use odd card choices that eventually lead to him playing the Call of the Hunted card that lets him resurrect all non-zombies from his graveyard, turn them into zombies that revive every time they're killed, and then start juicing the zombies up with the effect of another monster, filling his board with incredibly powerful cards that eventually could have even overrun Kaiba and his Blue Eyes White Dragons if they had kept getting stronger. And even as Jonouchi tries to play the Time Wizard and fails for the first time, losing a big chunk of his life points, even as things continue to get more dire along those lines, Jonouchi keeps fighting. He trusts his instincts and plays another spell card, Shield and Sword, that lets him do enough damage through the zombies to defeat Kozuka without actually defeating the zombies. It feels like the kind of intuitively simple and yet game-breaking play that Yugi often uses to win a duel. And it isn't until after that happens that Yugi shows up finally, having used the power of his Millennium Item to sort of halfway sense where Jonouchi was and lead the others to him after they realized that he was missing. And I won't say that Yugi didn't help him at all, because there are a couple of times when you can tell, as it's the other Yugi obviously, as he's feeling for Jonouchi with the Millennium Item, Jonouchi can kind of pick up on the sentiments that Yugi's feeling. So he had that little bit to motivate him forward, but there's no indication that he would have given up without that. Just that maybe it would have taken him a little longer to psych himself back up. Like, he still has a rough time here, and I don't think he would have gotten out of this situation with his star chips if his friends hadn't found him by the end here. I don't remember specifically what happens next. I think the dub, which again is what I primarily watched as a kid, kind of glosses over some of the stuff that happens next. I could be wrong though, I don't know. But I think it's safe to say that Keith would have tried to just steal his stuff if his friends hadn't shown up to help him, right? So it's not like he defeated these guys entirely on his own, but this is definitely more on his own than he's ever been before, and he did just fine. And he's about to have another duel immediately after this, where, at least as far as I'm concerned, he finally completes his arc for this tournament and becomes a true duelist. The duel in this one is really fun too, and I already mentioned that there are certain parallels that you can pick up on between Keith and Jonouchi, but there are parallels you can pick up on between Keith and Yugi too. He doesn't know who Yugi is, which is interesting because he's been out of the game for a while, but he recognizes immediately from the way his minions are talking about Yugi how important Yugi is, and he helps Kozuka throughout Kozuka's duel with Jonouchi the same way that Yugi used to help Jonouchi duel. But he's harsher about it. Instead of trying to help Kozuka along towards becoming a better and stronger duelist on his own and growing in his own power, you can tell that Keith thinks of Kozuka with this modified deck as an extension of Keith, rather than his own person. His strength is Keith's strength, and Kozuka and the others definitely feel the same way. So whereas he even gave them cards, the same way that Yugi gave Jonouchi some cards before the tournament to help him finish out his deck, you get the sense that this guy is as opposite the kind of person that Yugi is as he could possibly be. Especially since it's clear that he intends on betraying these guys. That he's just using them, and that's a thing that Yugi could never do to his friends. Either version of him. I also, like, the zombie stuff in this one is really cool. The imagery is great. Seeing the zombies rise out of the ground and then seeing them become more grotesque as the King of Ghosts pumps them full of energy. It's all fantastic. You guys know how I like horror imagery. But, man, I really, really hate this duel in some other areas because the card used here, Call of the Haunted, like, probably wouldn't be super broken anymore. But especially back when this was, like, becoming popular enough, that this manga/anime was becoming popular enough that they made a card game out of it, a real one. A card that just resurrects anything non-zombie from the graveyard over and over again forever would have been inconceivably game-breaking. Which is why it makes sense that they made Call of the Haunted into not a spell, but a trap that revives one monster once, slowing it down considerably and weakening its effect massively. And yet it was still pretty game-breaking back when it was first released, because this is a time before special summons were common, so summoning more than one monster a turn, even if you had to resurrect one of your own monsters that had already died, and therefore probably wasn't your first choice, was pretty important. And there was also this really interesting loop that used Call of the Haunted for a while. It used just 3 cards, like you had to clear out your opponent's board too, but it used just 3 cards. One called Machiur the Destructor, a monster that in a turn that it's sent to the graveyard, you can now activate traps from your hand for the rest of the turn. And keep in mind, traps can be activated during the battle phase. Another card called Dark Scorpion Chick the Yellow, who, when it attacks the opponent and does damage, you can return a card on the field, either field, to its owner's hand, and Call of the Haunted. What you would do is, most commonly what I'd see people do is they would play Graceful Charity. Almost said Call of the Haunted again. They'd play Graceful Charity to draw 3 cards. When they already had Machiur and Chick in their hand, discard them. That activates Machiur's effect. And then they would play Call of the Haunted from their hand, using Machiur's effect, to resurrect Chick, attack directly, use Chick's effect to send Call of the Haunted back to the hand. That destroys Chick, and then you just rinse and repeat. Attack as many times as you need to defeat your opponent in increments of 1,000 life points of damage. And obviously you can't do this if your opponent has a monster out that's bigger than Chick, but there are plenty of removal cards in the game. Especially at the time that this stuff was possible, there were plenty of removal cards in the game. You just had to draw into enough of those too. That should tell anyone who knows anything about the history of the game about the era when I was actually playing it semi-seriously. But yeah, it's one of my favorite loops in the game, and I don't think Chick or Call of the Haunted have been errated at all to stop the loop from being viable anymore, but I think Machiur was. I don't know. It's just really interesting. That's the kind of stuff that the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game used to do. And then they did something kind of similar with a card called Yatagarasu that could basically lock your opponent down and win you the game all entirely on its own, just so long as you were a competent player. Good times. But I'm going off on a tangent. These are really good chapters. They give us a really strong, visually dynamic duel, good character stuff for Jonouchi. They introduce interesting new characters, Keith more than any of the other ones, but I'd say Keith and Kozuka both are pretty interesting. And all of Keith's lackeys are interesting for wanting to follow him in the first place. We get to see Yugi use a little bit of magic. It's just overall pretty fun, and it leads directly into one of my favorite duels of this arc, which comes next in the Labyrinth. The only real issue I have with these chapters is, I would imagine just to pad it out a little bit, and it's not too terrible. It takes the others a really long time to realize that Jonouchi's taking longer than he should to pee. Like, I don't understand why he would have even gone so far away from them to pee that, like, they wouldn't have been able to hear him pee and therefore hear when he was finished peeing. Like, they realize that he hasn't come back. Like, call out to him. And if he doesn't answer, if he's far enough away that he doesn't answer, then you know you have a problem because he just walked off a little ways to pee. It's ridiculous. Like, the same scene almost plays out twice where they're like, Jonouchi's taking a while to get back. Jonouchi's taking a while to get back. Oh, now we should probably be worried about it. And, like, already a ton of stuff has happened with him being dragged off and going unconscious and being woken up and being put down by Keith and his lackeys for a while. Like, he was obviously gone for a long time. In between these two scenes. It doesn't make sense that they wouldn't have gotten worried sooner than they did. But that's really a minor complaint in the grand scheme of things. These chapters are otherwise extremely strong. All of that said, though, guys, what do you think of chapters 29 through 32 of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga, if you have read them? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, you might as well like the video, share it with anyone else you think would enjoy my content, subscribe if you haven't. You can also check out links to my various social medias as well as the many ways you can help out the channel. Those will be in the video description, but either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.